Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen-to podcast which explains why Indigenous partnerships are the key to securing successful outcomes in natural resource and infrastructure investment in Canada. I'm Mark McNacka and my co-host Robert Branton are joined today by Jonathan Davey, Managing Director of Indigenous and Government Advisory at Scotiabank. In part one of our conversation with John, we heard how a decade inside Canada's legal system shaped his understanding of Indigenous finance, why Scotiabank made a mutual investment in building their Indigenous advisory practice from scratch, and what the creation of Cedar Leaf Capital signals about where Canada's capital markets are heading. In the second part, we get into the details that really matter most for institutional investors evaluating opportunities in Canada. John breaks down Section 89 of the Indian Act, the single biggest barrier to capital access for Indigenous communities, and explains some of the novel structures practitioners use to work around it. We then move into the developments that are generally changing the calculus for international investors. Canada's $10 billion Indigenous Loan Guarantee Corporation, forthcoming amendments to the First Nations Fiscal Management Act, and what the Build Canada Act means for project timelines and Indigenous equity participation. If you haven't listened to part one yet, we'd encourage you to start there. But if you're coming straight to the numbers and the policy, this is the place to be.
Maybe, John, we could talk a little bit about the Indian Act and some of the specifics, because you are an expert and you've mentioned some of the issues. We had Tracy Smith recently on from Kiwewin Capital, and she set up that organization to try to fill a gap, a financing gap, particularly on reserve. And so maybe explain some of the very basics about what makes it difficult for banks and other lenders to finance on reserve in particular.
Sure, and especially, Rob, if you're a foreign investor looking to work with Indigenous groups, or you're looking at, major projects, major project development in Canada, and you're just, you don't know where to start. That's the perspective I'm taking this question from. I'd say Section 89 of the Indian Act is the best place to start, because it's the worst place. It's Section 89 says you can't use assets that are domiciled on reserve as collateral. So it undermines this ability to have, equity in fixtures and chattels and any assets that's domiciled on reserve if you're a First Nations person, business, or government. And so just if I was to stop there and not say anything else, you'd think, well, that's so prohibitive of accessing capital. Why would I ever want to work with a First Nation knowing that they have to operate under that constraint?
Yeah, when you think about what kind of a constraint that is, being able to leverage assets in your asset base, that is sort of fundamental to being able to grow and participate in any economy.
Exactly. And even, you mentioned Tracy being on the podcast before. I mean, housing is where it's, I think, most acute. Like, you can see it where if you can't have a traditional mortgage on reserve, how is it that you build equity on an individual basis, right? But I would say that, if you're looking at that, just understand that when we talk about restrictions, first of all, in that case, we're just talking about First Nations. We're not talking about Métis or Inuit. But it's also, okay, if you can't access capital, what does that actually mean? How do you work around it or work through it? So, we talked about why I enjoy working at Scotiabank so much. They were very supportive when I stood up the First Nation leasehold financing program. So leveraging leasehold interests under the Indian Act, First Nation Land Management Act, and self-governing agreements. So essentially to say that, hey, if Section 89 prevents you from taking an interest, a collateralized interest in a fixture like a home or a commercial building, the leasehold interest may allow you to take an interest in the lease itself, in the instrument that allows for use and access. And so this is some of the innovation that we're looking at, and we've been executing for a number of years now, to say that just because you see an impediment like Section 89 doesn't mean that there aren't ways that we can work around it. And Rob, some of the work that you've done and your firm has done to create investment vehicles that would create separation from, a First Nation government to a government business enterprise that might be owned by the nation, but you're creating these models of general partnerships and limited partnerships that then create own source revenue. What's really powerful about that people wouldn't realize at first blush if they're new to working with Indigenous groups or looking at the space, is the tax optimization that's allowed under legislation like the Indian Act to allow those entities to actually create a greater benefit and a greater yield on the return because they are not subject to the same tax laws as a non-Indigenous business. And so, it's one of these expansive questions, Rob, as you and Mark can appreciate. It's kind of like, what is math? And you try to start to explain it. Well, this is when we talk about restrictions, I think the vast majority of the time it reverts back to Section 89 and not being able to have a collateralized value of an asset on reserve and then the depreciation of that asset over time. So from the financial point of view, it makes it very detrimental. But what's great, and it doesn't act as a complete counterbalance, but it is something to consider, is just how do you set up the different investment structures, whether it's for the purpose of an SPV or it's just your economic development corporation in the form of a limited partnership. Why is it that those structures exist? How are they optimized? How do they reduce reliance on federal oversight? How is it that you can have greater control over an entity or over a business enterprise as a First Nation or First Nation government business enterprise, where you're actually able to invest in a different way that's more tax optimized and not subject to the same laws and regulations under the Income Tax Act or Indian Act that a non-Indigenous group will be subject to. So I would say that if you're new to this and you're looking at the Indian Act, just know that there's a big restriction at theirs. There's certainly others, but there's ways, like I was saying before, when it comes to the Indian Act, there's places of vulnerability and there's places of exploitation where you can actually exploit. I use in a positive way. Like you can actually work under the Indian Act in a way that would be beneficial to you. That I would certainly encourage anybody that's interested in knowing to reach out to us to talk about, because that's kind of where we operate.
So I also think if you look at financial markets worldwide, how have they grown so dramatically over the past half century? It's because this focus on innovation and where there's a will the way and how do you make it work? And I think you agree with that. That's basically what you're saying, the opportunity for innovation to unleash these assets, which there's still first mover advantages because we're still figuring out how best to access that and present those opportunities and find solutions that give this underrepresented communities, the First Nations, opportunities to succeed. And that's where some of the growth is coming from. Is that?
Sure, Mark. Like there's definitely innovation, and I think that's going to continue. I think what's new that's become a greater focal point is the concessionary capital that's coming into the market for Indigenous groups, as well as loan guarantees that will just lower risk weights on assets, on loans. And so,
explain a little bit about what you mean by concessionary capital.
Sure. So it's low cost of funds for Indigenous parties, particularly focus on Indigenous parties making an equity investment. And so, there's a couple of sources, but the biggest one is the First Nation Finance Authority. We're having this conversation now in March of 2026. We're going to see the First Nation Financial Management Act amended very soon to allow for the First Nation Finance Authority to provide concessionary capital to Indigenous special purpose vehicles. So right now they can only lend to Indigenous groups. And so what does that all mean if this is new information? Really what it nets out to is you have lower cost of capital for Indigenous groups that are looking to make an equity investment in some of these bigger projects. Coupled with that, you have loan guarantee programs federally. There's a $10 billion loan guarantee program. And then there's two programs that are worth $3 billion, one in Alberta, another in Ontario, and then BC, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba are all standing up or have stood up similar programs of a bit smaller scale. And essentially, when we talk about loan guarantees, we're talking about contingent liability that's dedicated to just backstopping loans. So if you're a financial institution like Scotiabank, the risk weights on the assets that you'd be deploying are just brought to zero, or they're brought down. So the cost of capital becomes lower again. And so if you're looking at investments that are happening, there's certainly a great incentive for Indigenous parties to come together, especially after this amendment to the First Nation Fiscal Management Act, for the purpose of making an equity investment. So when you do that, you get lower cost of funds, or you can get, I should say, you won't necessarily get, but you can get lower cost of capital that can then be put towards an equity purchase or an asset purchase. And where that becomes very appealing for anybody that's outside the community is you can only imagine what it's like if you were to, joint venture with that Indigenous special purpose vehicle or look to have an Indigenous partner. This is where I think a lot of people are focused, Mark. The innovation that we were talking about before under the Indian Act will continue to happen, and that's more liability and indemnity based. And so I like that because Rob's saying, you came from law and that's what you looked at. So I still gravitate to that naturally because I still think there's more that we can get out of the Indian Act in terms of what we can do in terms of innovation for financial products and services. But where the puck's going right now is lower cost of funds for Indigenous parties looking to invest. And so if you're hearing that and you're, outside of the country or you're just a non-Indigenous entity, it really makes a lot of sense for you to get a sense of how it is that you may want to partner with Indigenous groups, because there's incentive beyond the financial. There's a reason why every project of national interest, our federal government is saying we need Indigenous participation. And a big part of that is because we need the business acumen, we need the stewardship, we need the extracurricular knowledge that Indigenous parties bring towards these transactions in their operation. And so when you see that, and then you're incentivized by the lower cost of funds, and you're understanding that this is, contextually good for the country because historically has not been a good relationship between Indigenous groups and, the Crown. These are all reasons why there should be a greater focus on, okay, how do we make sure that we structure these transactions in such a way that's respectful, that's based on partnership and trust, but that are very sound in terms of their structuring for the financing? Like, how is it that we take it back to first principles of the Indian Act and understand that we're doing this in such a way where we're creating a good loan that's securitized, as opposed to just saying we want to rely on, loan guarantee, or we want to rely exclusively on concessionary capital. So there's moving parts. There's a lot of moving parts, but the Canada Infrastructure Bank also has capital that they can deploy, which would represent lower cost of funds than what you get if you're just to take it to market. And so making sure that we look at all those avenues to get the best possible transactions for Indigenous parties and their partners has become a real focal point in the last few years.
Very insightful. I'd like to come back to one point, because for our audience over here in the UK and other places around the world, we're in Canada, and you're talking about, and the Indigenous people in the Crown. And for a lot of people, except the Indigenous people, the Crown in Canada is something almost a virtual monarchy. And in the UK, you rarely hear people talk about the Crown because it's not in the day-to-day business. Of course, the authority comes from there, and constitutional monarchy, et cetera, et cetera. But also in this country, Canada, you're talking about Indigenous Crown. Can you give just a little background? Because reinforcing this story, I think, helps our audience understand the foundation and why we are where we are today.
Sure, Mark. So, it goes back to our Constitution here in Canada. So under Section 91(24) of the Constitution, I won't use the legal terms, but Aboriginal people, as it's described, so First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, are considered the responsibility of the federal state here in Canada. And so what that means is the representatives of the Crown, who are responsible for having passed legislation like the Indian Act and other associated legislation and decided a lot of the jurisprudence that's impactful, are the Crown's representatives. And so we're talking about the federal government predominantly, not the monarchy in its totality, but we're talking about really the federal responsibility within Canada to look at Indigenous parties and provide parameters, both legal and otherwise. So there's the relationship there that's inherent. The best example I can give to our audience, for anybody that wouldn't be initiated, is that healthcare in Canada is a provincial responsibility. But healthcare for the Indigenous populations is federal. And so it's this division of powers where you've got, the federal government being responsible for things that would otherwise be a provincial responsibility here. And so, and I mean, in some ways you could take it down to even the municipal level, but, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, constitutionally protected groups within the Constitution of Canada, but are treated differently than other populations within the country. So when we say the Crown, I mean, without getting too expansive, Mark, I mean, it's really the federal government here in Canada and their relationship with Indigenous groups and how that's evolving. I'm not gonna say whether I think it's getting better. I think more efforts are being made, and I think that's important. And I think that there's a greater awareness and desire to have a better relationship between Indigenous populations and the Crown or the federal government here in Canada. That's what I choose to believe, and that's why I try to, like I said, setting a good example, whether it's for my kids or whether it's for others. I recognize that if I honor the people that came before me, there were so many battles that were fought with the federal government over rights, over responsibilities, over access and control, that I'm in a very privileged position right now to say, well, we can build on those battles that have been fought and won by the Indigenous population so that we can have new opportunities like the ones that we're talking about today between Indigenous populations, and not just the Crown, but, really the wider global economy in terms of who wants to partner and work with Indigenous peoples.
Yes, and just again for our audience, Canada only acquired its constitution in the 80s. And before that, everything in theory was still under the Privy Council over here. So that was a game changer. And that's one of the stimuli for all these changes that we've experienced in our lifetimes, because it was in the Constitution. Whole different ballgame, because it just didn't work before.
Yeah, and Mark, and just to take it to another place too, like we can talk about the Constitution and constitutionally protected rights under Section 35 of the Constitution for Aboriginal people. Aboriginal is the term used in the Constitution. That's why I keep saying it. But the truth is that we need to look. A lot of people still want to talk about different standards, whether they be entrenched in the Constitution and protected by the Constitution. That has to be evident. There's a bigger focus now on the duty to consult and free, prior, and informed consent, which will soon become, I would say, more defined within Canadian law, more so than it already is. That has to happen, and that is happening. I think with the opportunities that we're talking about, though, when we talk about the greater economic participation of Indigenous parties in Canada, it's by a lot of members of the Indigenous population here that recognize, hey, we've got a great opportunity, not just from an economic standpoint, but a great opportunity to create a new relationship. And so I'm very optimistic about this. I'm taking a very optimistic tone and point of view, but I look at it more as what can we build together, right? And what is it that we're not going to forget our past, we're not going to forget the history, but how can we create a new relationship so that future generations can know that, you know what, we can change what's happened in the past such that it doesn't repeat itself. And that's really the approach I try to take. It's one of the reasons where I didn't necessarily think to work for the Crown initially until I had a great conversation with a law professor at Osgoode Hall, a professor named Shinamai, who said, in order to be a good lawyer, you have to understand all perspectives. And if you just look at the federal government as being oppressive towards Indigenous peoples, you'll never understand how things like the Indian Act or how the judiciary is going to decide cases. It's beneficial for you to understand that process, understand the perspective of the federal government. So, I take that into account. It is something I try to apply when we're talking about the transactions that we'd be looking at recently. But it's also, it's a history to remember, and it's certainly something that you can't ignore when it comes to the Constitution and the historic relationship between the two groups.
John, you mentioned you're excited, positive about current developments. At least we get asked sometimes, particularly from investors outside of Canada, what has changed, or has Canada really changed over the last 10, 15 years? They may have got excited about LNG, for example, 15 years ago, and projects that were proposed but never got off the ground. So how would you answer that kind of question?
In terms of what projects they get excited about, Rob?
No, about what has Canada changed? Is it really different? Why should we look at Canada again differently?
I it's a great question. Like beyond what we've just talked about in terms of this desire to have a greater or better relationship, an improved relationship with Indigenous parties, uh, you can look at Bill C-5 and the Build Canada Act and what the federal government's done. Like there is this desire to invest in the country, to unite the country through development. At least that's one interpretation of it. So I would say what's changed. I mean, that comes to mind very quickly, Rob. I'm also seeing, how do we build out our infrastructure within Canada in such a way that makes us stronger as a country, makes us more efficient as a country, given how vast we are. But, in this current climate also allows us to diversify our trade partners. And so, I go back to something Mark said right at the start, is that in order to do that, if you're going to invest in new energy corridors in Canada, if you're going to create new infrastructure in Canada that didn't exist prior, if you're going to have greater defense spending, which has been a big focal point, if you're literally going to create an act called Build Canada, you need Indigenous participation. And so what's changed here is the recognition that that's the truth. You have to have Indigenous participation. It's not a threat. It's an opportunity. The opportunity is all the things that we've talked about before. You get greater business acumen coming from the Indigenous community because it is so restrictive to run a business within a First Nation. It's so difficult. It's difficult to run any business. Try doing it with the restrictions that we've talked about as they apply to the Indian Act. When you see that and you see how the federal government is saying, we're not just saying we want greater Indigenous participation, we're actually inducing it in some respects, because we're going to amend legislation to allow for concessionary capital to flow into these investment vehicles that are Indigenous. We're going to see the Canada Indigenous Loan Guarantee Corporation, which is doing a great job, stood up and have $10 billion in contingent liabilities that they can use to backstop loans that are going to help build this country. And so when that starts to happen, I would say that's a massive sea change. It's not just this administration. I think it's really concentrated in this federal administration. But I would say that that's a big change that we've seen over, relatively short period of time. The Major Projects Office is another example of that. You've got an office that's dedicated to these projects of national interest. And so what's changing here is that you have a designation program that's saying, listen, if you're concerned about licensing and permitting, whether you're a foreign entity or you're domestic, you have to know that we're creating a permit window. This is going to happen faster. We are behind this. We are designating projects for this purpose to get things built faster. We're putting capital into market to make sure that they're capitalized enough, to be commissioned and performing their function and generating revenue. So I would say that's kind of the real excitement. I think if you look at even things that are ancillary to that, I mean, we talked about me being in the office of the CEO, and I really enjoyed that experience. And when I left, somebody said, "Are you excited to go and work in Indigenous and government advisory?" And I said, "It's a dream come true." And they kind of laughed. They said, "It's a dream. You're telling me it's a dream come true to go, work in investment banking? Is that really what you saw yourself doing?" I said, "It's a dream come true because I never thought that I'd see opportunities of this magnitude and frequency involving our relations." And so this is what gets me really excited. This is something that I think is emerging. I don't think it's brand new, but I do think it's been kind of emerging over time. And Rob, Mark, the fact that we're having this conversation now and we're talking about things like foreign investors' interest in Canada and working with Indigenous populations. I mean, if you go back 5 years, I don't know if we would have had the same conversation. In fact, I know it wouldn't have been the same conversation. I don't know if we would have had the conversation at all. So I would say, like, what's new is, certainly the Build Canada Act has put a greater focus on development within Canada. And some of the concessionary capital and loan guarantee programs are certainly putting an emphasis on making sure that there is Indigenous participation.
Yeah, I agree with all of that wholeheartedly. That's why I'm back in Canada. That's after so many years abroad. It's just too exciting not to come back and get right in the thick of it.
Exactly.
5 years ago is almost a century in the world we're living in, because a year and a half ago the world changed. Sure. And I think there's so many businesses with all the discussions, and the Prime Minister is out there looking at opportunities for Canada, for new markets, new partners, to make things happen. So it's a real exciting time to be in the role that you're at. And I think Scotia is one of the first banks, if not the first bank, to set up the type of unit that you're now responsible for. Is that correct?
I believe so, Mark. I mean, I think the bank has taken a good approach to that question, because we certainly talked about it in talking to members of global banking and markets. We discussed the opportunity that this represents. But I don't think, you may not have heard that there's a big focus on first to market or only in market, because I do think that this is something that is being replicated and we'll certainly see more of as years to come. And like I said, the collegiality amongst the banks as competitors to say, hey, if there's a good practice in the market, we all need to be doing it. We all need to be competing. We need to make sure that the net beneficiary is, the Indigenous community. I see it as, I'm doing the best I can with this opportunity because I believe in it. I respect the fact that Scotiabank has said, we think there's a great opportunity for you to help a lot of people here and provide financial services to people and financial advisory where the transactions are a bit more new and nuanced. And I think the response from the community at large has been, this is great. This is a good thing. We need to understand, exactly how it is that you and your group fit into what we're trying to do here, and where is it that we can really bring a lot of this to fruition. And so it's been a great experience, Mark, in having those discussions. I'm obviously very optimistic, and when I say it's a dream come true to be in this role, it's this idea of, it's a huge responsibility to make sure that if we are looking at opportunities of this magnitude and this frequency, that the Indigenous populations are not just benefiting from the net end result, right? When all the debt service is done and the proceeds are flowing, that's one thing. It's a lot like what Cedar Leaf Capital is doing. How can we help build capacity so that others, no different, Rob, than I've looked up to the work that you've done and Clint Davis has done and Ron Jameson. How is it that I can do my best to set a positive example and be an exemplary model for somebody that may one day want to be in a role like this and be far, more equipped and focused on their contribution in this role. So that's, honor the people that came before you, but make things better for future generations. I'm just trying to set the best example and sincerely hope that we see other competitors in the market follow suit in terms of providing something similar. We're already seeing it, but, more formalized so that you get that talent behind you that's going to, be able to do this for years to come.
John, before, we finish, we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about your connections to the Canadian military and some of the work you do in your spare time with, and I know you don't have a lot of spare time with your young family and your day job, but tell us a little bit about that.
Thanks, Rob. Very, very proud to be a member of the Canadian Armed Forces. I'm a captain with the Queen's York Rangers, 1st American Regiment. We're an armored unit based out of Toronto and Aurora, Ontario. Been doing it for, I guess, 16 plus years now. We talk about decisions that we make in our career, and you guys said, how did you move from law to finance? And something that's been constant throughout has been my time as a reservist and going through my military training. It takes on a bit of a different context now with what's going on in the world. Certainly, I think everyone's on much more high alert in the last few days than they have been in a long time. And you look at what Canada is saying when it comes to defense spending and increasing that, and looking at defense as a sector that's going to include a lot more things than just some of the more traditional things that you'd associate with military service. But for me, Rob, it's certainly, I'd say as I get older, it's been an outlet. But when I was a younger person doing it, I really established a lot of character in me to try to be a better leader. Stuff that I think I had a good foundation for when I worked with Scott Thompson and see a leader in action and understand how to model myself better in those tough situations and how to just be someone that can be reliable. I don't know what else to say about it other than I love it. I mean, there's no feeling quite like putting on the uniform to serve your country, and the people that are like-minded and do the same, I have a special place in my heart for, and they become some of the closest people in my life. So it's something that certainly informs what I do, but I also like what it represents as well, where the relationship between the Canadian Armed Forces and Indigenous populations, if you go back over the years, hasn't always been a good relationship, much like with the Crown and Indigenous populations in Canada. So I want to be the change that I'd like to see, and really make sure that we've just got some phenomenal soldiers who are Indigenous. And, seeing that gives me so much pride and inspiration and confidence, because you can see it in the military. It could be trying at times, but when people, get through it and they've got that confidence built and they're proud to represent their community, whether they're Indigenous or not Indigenous, I think the military has that power. So I'm a very big supporter. I appreciate you asking about it, just because it is a big part of my life. It's been tougher to do since having two beautiful kids. But it gives me a lot of pride in who I am and what I do. And I like the idea that it's to the best of my ability, I try to represent my community, like the Lower Cayuga community of Six Nations of the Grand River. I hope that they feel some pride in the fact that, one of their members is a captain in the Canadian Armed Forces.
Yeah, I'm sure they do. And just to come back from a historical perspective, Canada would not exist as a country today if it was not for the Indigenous warriors.
I agree, Mark. I encourage you to look more at some of the work that's been done to celebrate some of the Indigenous warriors, past and present. Jean Miso is an author. She created a book where she highlights some Indigenous soldiers. I was honored to be a part of that project. But I agree, like the fabric of Canada as a country, there's so much of it is tied to Indigenous peoples and the cultures, histories, traditions, and languages. And so military is one part of it. I won't say anything else because I know people have different opinions on it. I want to be respectful of everybody listening, but I take a great amount of pride in being in the Canadian Armed Forces and being an Indigenous person. And I'm just grateful for the opportunities that's afforded me and for the structure that's given me in my life.
Yeah, well, as Mark mentioned, and you too, over the centuries, time and time again, governments, Crown have relied on Indigenous support, military alliances, economic alliances, usually to fend off some other influence. So you're another fine example of Indigenous people stepping up and defending this country and our values. So thank you for your service in all its forms. You do an awful lot.
Well, it's an honor to serve, Rob and Mark. Thanks very much for setting up this forum. It's great to talk to you both, whether it's on the podcast or whether it's offline. I have a tremendous respect for both of what you're doing. And like I said, when it comes to removing vulnerability, you need discussions like this and like the discussions you've had with so many others to share some knowledge, invite curiosity, and give people a way that they can learn a bit more, so that should they want to have a new relationship with Indigenous populations, or should they want to learn more about who Indigenous peoples are and what we do, I just am grateful that this exists so that people have that outlet.
John, maybe before we wrap up, why don't you talk about the summit coming up from the perspective of Scotia being the headline sponsor, what you're looking for, why you think, people should be sign up to attend, what they're going to benefit from, how this fits into what Scotiabank's trying to achieve.
Sure, Mark. And thanks again for the partnership between the Canada Indigenous Investment Summit and Scotiabank. Really, my understanding, my approach to why this is an important partnership is because for all the things that we've talked about where we're going to see greater Indigenous participation in major projects in Canada, the summit's really created an excellent forum for discussion to talk about some of the opportunities, but certainly some of the challenges as well, and how we work through them. I consider it a solutions-based summit. And so whether it's what you hear on stage through the panelists or the conversations that you have, when you're grabbing a coffee, it's really focused on one thing: is how do we propel this forward in a way that's respectful and from an Indigenous perspective? And in the same time, how do we bring in people that haven't always been at the table, right? Like when we talk about foreign investment or foreign joint ventures and partnerships with Indigenous groups, I mean, I think the summit really represents this forward edge thinking in terms of we need to get Indigenous populations, especially as these special purpose vehicles come together, introduced to other partners that they wouldn't otherwise think of. And so I find it's a welcoming summit. It's not a pretentious summit in the sense that you can come there with very little knowledge and leave with a lot, and certainly have a pocket full of cards of people to talk to continue on the conversation. But what I really liked about it is it's focused on a delegation. You've put the right people together to have the conversations, and those conversations aren't a bunch of heads nodding. There's different perspectives of how things can be done and where the opportunities are. So we're a very proud sponsor of the Canada Indigenous Investment Summit. Very proud to be delegates at the summit, and looking forward to everyone that's going to attend. And just as much looking forward to the relationships that will be formed and continued on. Keep doing what you're doing. This is important. The work you're doing through Drumbeats, the work that you're doing through the summit, keep leading. This is a great thing that you've done. I can't say that enough, between the summit and the other forums that you've created for discussion. But now you're seeing people start to come in, and you're seeing greater subscription. I would say thank you for doing that, and let us know how we can help manage the growth, and do so in such a way that brings more people in and makes sure that this is a very inviting place, whether it's a summit or Drumbeats or anything else that you're looking to do. So just thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you, and Scotiabank. Rob, is there anything?
Yeah, we would
to
say the same. John, keep doing what you're doing. Really enjoying watching your career evolve and the impact that you are having. So congratulations on the new role. Nyawangoa for being part of this podcast today, and we'll look forward to seeing you in London shortly.
Looking forward to it. Rob, Mark, thank you both very much.
Okay, thank you very much for your time today, John. Appreciate that. Thank you to Jonathan Davey for sharing his insights with us, and thank you for viewing and listening. Mark your calendars for the upcoming 2026 summit taking place on the 8th of April. Be sure to share, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast channel. Thanks for listening to Drumbeats. Until next time.